Hey class, welcome back to Strategies of Missions and Leadership Development. Last time we finished up our look at life on the field, looking at the missionary family and how they live. And today we're going to be looking at a very important topic. As a missionary goes into a new field or a new environment, they may have culture shock. Stay tuned for the PowerPoint.
Okay, class, we'll continue on now with our PowerPoint today. And we're looking at session 19, culture shock. And much like I said last time, as you go into this new environment and the life on the field, the missionary may encounter culture shock. And again, this comes from Herbert Kane's Life and Work on the Mission Field, and it is just a great book that covers a lot of different areas for life on the field for the missionary. And one of the areas to draw from Kane is the look at culture shock. So just some introductory material again, as we usually have. Missionaries must be able to deal with culture shock, otherwise they will be a hindrance to the very mission that they are on. And when someone goes into a new environment, and if the culture shocks them to where it almost causes them to not even be able to function properly, it can be a real hindrance to the mission they're on. So one of the biggest things that can hit people when they go to a new field is the language. And of course, many mission agencies require some sort of language competency before you even go there. But if the person is not, let's say, up to speed on the language, or they didn't do so well in learning it, and they're now in the field, that can really be a culture shock to them. And if they don't learn the language, or let's say it's just too much of a shock and they kind of withdraw from the society, well, that's going to hinder the very mission that they're on. So culture shock needs to be dealt with. First off, culture shock is real, and it needs to be understood that way. It cannot be some sort of an imaginary kind of thing. Well, that's just them making it up. The missionary just having a tough time adapting, and so they're not. It's not really culture shock. It's just they can't really adapt too well. Well, no, it is real. It is not imaginary. And they need sympathetic guidance. So this is where, if a country has a missionary network already set up, those missionaries that are veteran missionaries to that area, they need to remember what it was like when they first arrived in the field, and how they dealt with culture shock. And the person that is struggling with culture shock needs a sympathetic ear, and sympathetic guidance needs to be given. And also, culture shock is a universal phenomenon. Okay, so don't think that, well, if you go to some tribe in the middle of Africa somewhere that lives in a mud hut, well, that's the real culture shock, because you're going from the United States with your cell phones and your internet and your nice house to this mud hut in the middle of nowhere. You'll experience culture shock. And that's not really the case. It's a universal phenomenon, so no matter what country you are going to or you are from, any culture is going to impact the person, and that can be from minor impacts to severe impacts. But no matter where you go, there is going to be some sort of culture shock. So let's say you did go to a European country. Let's say you went to Scotland, and you sat down for your first meal, and they served you haggis, which is sheep lung, and we usually don't eat too much haggis in the United States, but there they do. And so next thing you know, you're in this country that's pretty well developed, is Scotland. You're pretty well developed there, and they give you some weird food to eat. There's going to be some culture shock right there just dealing with food. So it's a universal phenomenon. It doesn't have to be some severe thing like in a tribal village in the middle of Africa. It can be in an urban area in Europe. So continuing with our introductory material with culture shock, it also varies in intensity. Modern culture to a less developed culture, there's going to be varying intensity of culture shock, but it still will be there. So looking at culture shock, it is easier going up the social scale. So what that means is if you're going from a poor society to a wealthy one, it is easier. You're not going to have as much culture shock. But for missionaries in the United States especially, if you are used to modern conveniences or more of a wealthy culture or higher economic class or something like that, and you're going down the social scale to, let's say, a poorer culture, that doesn't have as much, it will be harder to adapt and there will be more severe culture shock. So this is just some introductory material looking at these a couple different aspects. And then also it is usually harder on the missionary wife than on the missionary husband. And that is because the missionary husband is usually involved in mission work more than the wife. Now, that does not mean that she's not involved in mission work. She is. But if a husband and wife have children, the wife will have these other things going on in her life, let's say raising children, caring for children, making meals or whatever, that the husband is not focusing on. And so the missionary husband may be distracted by other things, but than the missionary wife. Although not completely distracted, the husband will still have to deal with some things, but the husband may be focusing on other things that the wife is not focusing on, and she may be hit with the culture shock more. The missionary wife may be focused on the domestic and home environment or the children. So let's just say that, for example, the domestic or home environment, let's say she needs to go to the marketplace. Let's say the husband is at the ministry or doing the mission or doing something like that, and she has to go to the market. Well, all of a sudden, she's completely dealing with the culture or the social aspects of a marketplace, and that may hit her harder than it would the husband. So that's just a quick example. Also, we need to see that culture shock does occur in stages. Culture shock occurs when someone steps foot in the field. So immediately upon arrival, there's going to be things hitting the missionary, and that could be maybe the different weather or climate, customs. All of a sudden, they get picked up at the airport to go to where they're going to be, and they stop at a restaurant or they stop to get something to eat, and there's different customs that are being used, and then you sit down at the table and the person is using a different language, and you might not be familiar with those words that they're using. You may have had language training, but you're not familiar with some of the words. And then also the food that is being ordered or being brought to you may be quite different. And this can all be very exciting. The missionary is ready to go. They're excited to serve the Lord. They're excited to have all these new experiences, and it's very exciting. But then after 6 months of that, it's not so much exciting anymore. Usually that excitement wears off pretty quick, and it gets to this point of we really didn't expect things to be like this. And so the culture shock is hitting them pretty hard, and then they settle into their life, maybe 1 to 3 years in the mission of that culture. And what can happen is they're adapting to the culture, they're getting used to the culture. Let's say the culture shock is wearing off, but they really start to begin longing for home, and they're really thinking about the culture that they came from. And so that can be that can also affect the missionary there. Culture shock does occur in stages, to the point of where if the person does decide they're going to go home, they go home, and then all of a sudden there's a culture shock that they experience when they get home, because they've been out of let's say, the culture of the United States for 3 years or 5 years, and all of a sudden they're back in that culture, and there's almost like culture shock when they get back home, and the missionary may be drawn back to the field. They've been living in that on that mission field for 3 to 5 years, and they may be drawn back to returning to the field. And so they have experienced the wealth, the TV, the modern conveniences, all of that, and now they kind of have that culture shock of being back home, and they've been used to not having that stuff, and so they may be drawn back to the field. But the point is that everyone does react differently to culture shock. Okay, so let's look at some contributing factors for culture shock. First is the climate. It could be hot, cold, dry, jungle, desert, rain. Whatever the climate is most likely is going to be different than from, let's say, the climate of where the missionary came from in the United States. And so the climate is going to be different. That's a contributing factor. Also poverty. When a person leaves the United States and goes into a country where there's extreme poverty, maybe slums, beggars everywhere, people begging for food, begging for money. Maybe people are actually like digging through trash cans and garbage dumps to survive. So there could be extreme poverty, and that can be a culture shock there. Also, hunger usually comes with the poverty, is people being hungry, but also there could be famine in the land that the person is ministering in, and there could be like starving children. And you think about maybe images you've seen on TV or in magazines or in pictures or whatever, that starving children where they're very skinny with distended bellies, where their bellies are very large because basically they're just filled with gas. So extreme hunger in places, and so that could be a culture shock. Also disease, malaria, people suffering from dysentery, dental problems, where the indigenous people might be missing the majority of their teeth. There could be disfigurement, open sores. People walking around in bare feet all the time can get sores and get all kinds of problems with their feet. There could be emaciated people, starving people, people dealing with different diseases. These are contributing factors of culture shock, where a missionary would not see that in the United States, but in the culture they're in, it's very common. Also, like I said, the language can be a contributing factor of culture shock, especially in the beginning of a ministry, where the person may have gone to language school, they just might not be very fluent in it, or there's different words being used they're not familiar with. That can cause the person to feel helpless, frustration. There's different reactions to the level of language that is there in the field that the missionary is using or used to, and so it could be pretty impactful to that missionary. Also, customs are different in different areas of the world, and that can be a contributing factor to culture shock. I mean, everything from shaking hands to tipping at a restaurant. So what do you do? I put it on the screen there, 1,001 ways. What that means is there's 1,001 ways that you can break social customs. So you need to know the customs. Well, how do you know the customs right away? How do you learn them? All of a sudden you see people doing this and that, and you're like, I'm not used to that. And so that's a contributing factor to culture shock. And also inconveniences can impact people. Lack of plumbing or poor plumbing. One of the things that struck me when I was in several South American countries was they don't flush their toilet paper. After we use it here in the United States, we just flush it down the toilet. But there they don't flush it. They put it in a trash can next to the toilet. And if you're in a missionary home, or you're in let's say the church building, and there's a trash can with a whole bunch of different people using that with their toilet paper, it's not what we're used to. It's definitely because of the poor plumbing that they have, and so that's an inconvenience. That we just can't flush it down, so that would have to be used to. Also, electricity could be on and off throughout the day. It could be have brownouts, blackouts. Different times the electricity just shuts off, or the electricity in the home might be different than the United States. Like I said, in the United States we have good lighting, we have good electricity, but the home that I was in Uruguay, the bedroom I was in, I shared with another missionary that we were there together, and there was one single light bulb hanging from a wire in the center of the room. It was just a wire sticking out of the ceiling, went down to a socket, and there was a light bulb on it with a pull string. And that was our light for the room. And at nighttime it was pretty dim. There was not a lot of light off that one little light bulb in the room. And so you just have to get used to that. Well, that's compared to the United States, you would say, well, that's an inconvenience. I mean, of course, I was thankful that we had light in the room, and it was electric. It wasn't like a candle, but it was just different, and it was a culture shock. Also, phone service. We have cell phones on us all the time. Internet. People watching Netflix on their phones or YouTube. There might not even be phone service where the missionary is at, and so that's a contributing factor to culture shock. So how does one overcome culture shock? Well, number one is we need to remember that Jesus left glory and stepped into this world. So if anyone understands culture shock, it will be Jesus. Now, of course, nothing shocks God. So that's that first bullet point there. Nothing shocks God. But we do need to remember that Jesus left glory. He left the presence of God, the glory and majesty of heaven, his throne. He left that to come to this earth. As it says in 2 Corinthians 8:9, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for our sakes he became poor, that you through his poverty might become rich. Now, of course, the context there is about Christ being our pattern and how we should follow Christ, as Paul is writing. But the point is that Christ made himself poor. He was rich in everything. In all of his glory and majesty, he was rich. but he came to this earth and made himself poor. So although nothing shocks God, he stepped into a different world. He was in the heavenly world, and then he came to this world. So we need to remember that Jesus went through this himself. Also, number two, we need to recognize that culture shock is a normal reaction. It affects everybody in some way, and it is normal no matter what it is, whether that be a minor culture shock to anything pretty severe. It's normal to react to the environment we are in. It's just that we cannot allow it to cause us to not be able to function. So don't think that experiencing culture shock makes somebody weak. Obviously, if it goes to where it's like debilitating and they're just not able to even do the mission or function, well, that's a major issue. But the majority of people, it's just reacting to the different culture that they're in, and most people can overcome all of this that we're talking about. Now, number three, we need to know that others have survived it. We can't imagine that we're the first person to ever deal with culture shock, and don't imagine that it's the worst. There are definitely people that have lived through things a lot worse than what we go through. So others survive it. Many have survived it, and so will the next missionary, which could be you. Number four, learning the language as quickly as possible is a great way to overcome culture shock. So not being able to communicate is a main reason for it and for cultural stress, but learning the language can overcome most issues. It's a main point. I can't stress it enough. Learning the language is a major thing to do because it will overcome almost all the problems because you'll be able to communicate. And so learning language can overcome almost anything dealing with culture shock. And also, number five, do not stay away from people. So when people deal with culture shock, it may be where they're uncomfortable and they want to kind of withdraw from the society. But really, ministry is participation in the life of the culture and the people group you're there to minister with. So you need to participate in that life, participate in the church, participate in the ministries that are going on, participate in the culture, have friends in the culture. So this is just a few points there, but don't stay away from people. Also, when you are with the people, it helps you with language learning because you're immersed in the culture and you can learn the language and customs better, so it's not so much of a culture shock. Number six, people need to look for the good and be optimistic. And so this is the classic, is the glass half empty or half full? And so an optimist would say it's half full, a pessimist would say it's half empty. We need to look for the positive things in life and have an optimistic outlook. It's not going to be that bad. Yes, we do have some bad days, and yes, there might be some frustrating days, but we always look to the future and having a positive outlook on things. There are pleasant and unpleasant things in every culture. You can say that about the United States. Even in the missionaries' hometown or home culture, there's good and bad, there's pleasant and unpleasant. So we also will have to expect to see that in the culture that we go to, but we don't shut down because of it. We need to focus on the pleasant things and also focus on the future of the ministry. Number seven, don't think back about life, quote unquote, back in the U.S. If all we do is focus on what we're missing and the things back home, that's going to be really hard to really start feeling welcome or feeling the good things of the culture that you're in on the mission field. Of course, we do think about things back home and there's memories about it, but we don't dwell on that. Don't think about what you're missing, because if every time you sit down at the dinner plate in your new culture or in the missionary's culture and you're thinking about the meal you had at McDonald's, or you're missing your favorite food or whatever it may be, you're going to really start emotionally having issues. So don't start thinking about that. You will never feel at home if all you focus on is what is, quote unquote, back home. No, your new home is on that mission field, and so you need to adapt to that. But if you just keep focusing on back in the United States or back home, there's definitely going to be some issues. So don't think about that. And also, we need to just trust God. To overcome culture shock, trust God. Let's look at a couple of verses here. Philippians 4:11-12 says this, "Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. So right there, Paul is saying to the church of Philippi, hey, wherever I'm at, number one, I'm content. I could have less things, I could have more things, but whatever it is, I'm content. 2 Corinthians, we'll look at a couple of verses there. 12:9 says, and he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. So again, trust God. His grace is sufficient. His grace will overcome any kind of culture issue or culture shock that somebody is having. 2 Corinthians 9:8 also says this, and God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. So the missionaries there on the field doing the good work, doing the work for God, and as that verse says, it's a promise, honestly, from God, that all of His grace will abound towards you, and everything that is from God will be sufficient for you and to help you overcome any issues that may come up in the new culture you are in. Okay, so that is it for this PowerPoint. I'll see you in a second.
All right, class, that's it for today. Next time we'll be looking at how the missionary deals with stress. I'll see you then.